One cold winter night, a 16-year-old girl named Brittany was home alone watching TV. Her parents had gone out to a dinner party. It snowed heavily all afternoon, but Brittany felt nice sitting on the sofa in the lounge, tucked up under a fuzzy. By midnight, Brittany's parents were still not home, and she began to feel uneasy. Yet she didn't want to call them. The television was in the corner of the room, right next to the big bay window. She was watching one of her favorite movies, when suddenly, out of the corner of her eye, she noticed something moving in the window. Through the darkness and the falling snow, she could make out the figure of a man, walking towards the window. As he got closer, she was able to make out his face, and it filled her. The man's face was hideously scarred. His eyes were wild and crazy, and he seemed to be grinning maliciously at her. Frightened, Brittany pulled the blanket over her head and hid there. She hardly moved. Slowly, she pulled the blanket aside just enough to peer out with. The man was still there. He was just standing there, staring directly at her. Then, he reached into his coat and pulled something out. It was a long knife. She managed to move her hand slowly over to her pocket and took out her mobile phone. Pressing the buttons in a panic, she dialed 911 and she waited for an answer. When the operator asked, "What is your emergency?" Brittany put the phone close to her face and whispered, "There's a man outside my window. He's got a knife. Please come quickly." She sat motionless under the blanket. Eventually, she heard sirens outside and the police started banging on her front door. Brittany pulled off the blanket and rushed to the front door, letting the two police officers inside. They said they had seen no trace of anyone outside her house. "He was right there," said Brittany, pointing out the bay window to her snow-covered front lawn. "That's not possible," said the female officer. "There couldn't have been anyone standing out there. The snow is completely undisturbed." "But he was standing right there, staring straight at me," said Brittany. "I saw him with my own two eyes." "Maybe you've been watching too many scary movies." The officers turned to leave when all of a sudden, the female officer stopped dead in her tracks. She pulled back the sofa that Brittany had been sitting on. Her jaw dropped and her eyes widened in shock. Brittany and the male police officer gasped. On the carpet behind the sofa, there was a trail of wet footprints and a discarded knife. "You were looking at his reflection. He was standing right behind you all along. You are lucky to be alive right now." In a small village in Mexico, two young boys were sitting on a wall watching the people pass by. It was a hot, lazy day and the sun beating down. The kids were taking shelter beneath the shade of an old oak tree. Just as they were about to doze off, they saw a tall, dark stranger approaching. His appearance startled them, and they noticed how strangely the man walked. He was dressed from head to toe in black. His jet black hair was slicked back, and he wore an expensive black suit with a tie. His clothing looked out of place in the dusty Mexican village. As the man in black drew nearer, one boy felt a chill run down his spine. The other boy's hair was standing on end. Neither of them knew why. "Are you hungry?" asked the man in black. Before the boys could reply, the man took his hand out of his pocket and held out some money. One of the boys eagerly reached out and grabbed the cash. "Don't take anything from him," whispered the other boy in a warning tone. The first kid ignored his friend and greedily stuffed the bills into his pockets. He was surprised to find that he had broken out into a cold sweat. "Don't take his money," said the other kid. The first kid turned to his friend and, in an angry voice, he shouted, "Shut up." When he turned back, he was shocked to see that the man in black had disappeared. He quickly got to his feet and looked up and down the street, but there was no sign of the tall, dark stranger. He felt a strange creeping fear wash over him. "Didn't you see his feet?" asked the other kid. "Of course you didn't. You were too busy looking at the money in his hands. You didn't even pay attention to his feet." The first kid was confused and didn't answer at first. His hands were shaking and he just stood there looking down at the ground. In the dust, there was a trail of cloven hoofprints. "You know who that was, don't you?" said other kid. That man was the devil. When I was young, my mother brought me to visit my grandmother at the old farmhouse where she lived. Every night, she would put me to bed in the upstairs room while she slept on the couch downstairs. Every night as I lay in the darkness, I would hear a scratching noise in the attic. It was very slow and sounded like it was moving back and forth, like a pendulum. Back and forth, back and forth, it would sweep across the ceiling. At first I was scared, but after a while I got used to it, and the slow, steady rhythm of the scratching would lull me into an uneasy sleep. A few years later, when my grandmother passed away, my mother and I were cleaning out her house. We were in the attic, moving some old boxes, when I noticed something in the middle of the wooden floor. Under the thick covering of dust that had collected over the years, there were visible scratches in the wood. Chucking, I called my mother over and told her how, as a child, I often heard a scratching noise coming from the attic when I slept in the room below. My mom's face grew pale and she gently took me by the shoulders. In a trembling voice, she told me that her father had lost his job in the Great Depression and could barely afford to feed his family. He came home one night and hung himself in the attic with a horse. Apparently, at the last moment, he regretted his decision because he struggled to gain his footing and his flailing boots had scratched the wooden floor where he had hung himself.